Thanks so much, Heather and Dr. Goss, for inviting me. And thanks to all of you here at Harborview Medical Center. I really would not be standing here literally if it weren't for all of you. And actually, it's kind of odd to be standing here because, as Heather said, I am a forest ecologist. But then I realized, it isn't so weird because I, as a forest ecologist, seek to understand these very complex systems of trees and to mitigate the problems that happen with deforestation. And all of you are involved with this understanding and mitigating problems of the human body, another very complex system. They're both like tapestries, I think, and I'd like to sort of hearken and use as a theme the idea of tapestry. And I love this little poem by Rabindranath Tagore. The tapestry of life's story is woven with the threads of life's ties, ever breaking and joining. And so today I'd like to use that theme to talk about disturbance and recovery, about the discoveries we make to keep the tapestries that we are dealing with intact, and to understand how to interweave in order to understand and mitigate problems. And so that we both really, or all of us really, I think, are creating tapestries of recovery, tapestries of healing, me of the earth and you of human bodies that are also intricately connected. So when I think of tapestries, then I think of something that is complex, something that has connections, something that is strong and yet fragile, something that is useful and also beautiful. And so what I'd like to do today is take that metaphor. I'll first use the metaphor of tapestry to talk about the tapestries that I work with, tropical rainforests, which are really tapestries themselves. And really, the work that I've done to understand them really led to my being here at Harborview, I falling out of a tree, and my subsequent sort of disturbance and recovery from that. Second, I'd like to share my reflections on how to understand this event through sort of tapestry thinking, through systems, understanding systems, and especially systems from different disciplines. So I'll talk about sort of an interdisciplinary work of understanding systems. And finally, I'd like to share some reflections that I have on ways that broad insights on disturbance and recovery from a number of systems might reflect and provide some insights for you involved with the medical profession. So the rainforest tapestry is one that is complex. It's a really wonderful tapestry. I've spent a lot of time, and we ecologists, when we study complex systems, we have to focus in on one part of them, and I chose to study the forest canopy, the part of the forest that's high above the forest floor, the treetops. This was a place that was really virtually unknown 30 years ago. My colleagues and I have developed the use of mountain climbing techniques, which for me, the last 36 years was a very safe place, a safe way of getting into the treetops, and it was also non-destructive for the trees themselves. I have had the privilege over the last 35 years of documenting the diversity of animals and plants that live up there, the importance of ecosystem functions of canopy-dwelling plants and animals, the interactions of atmospheric forces, of gases, of nutrients, and of water that come into forest canopies and are captured, retained, and then moved to other parts of the forest canopy. So it's a really important, really interesting, really fantastic part of the forest canopy to study. Unfortunately, the forest canopy is getting worn out many times because of human activities, of mining, of deforestation, of agriculture. And that is what I've been studying most recently, especially the aspect of forest fragmentation. That is the reduction of primary forest to very small fragments, even down to what we call a single relic tree. I was very interested in understanding whether the presence of these relic trees, if a farmer would leave one of these trees in a pasture, might it contribute to the enhancement of diversity and of ecosystem function as it did function in its primary forest habitat. Well, it was in the progress or the process of carrying out research on these relic trees that I had an accident. My rope failed in climbing trees on the Olympic Peninsula on July 3rd of 2015. I fell like as my graduate student said, a silent sack of sand directly to the forest floor, falling from 50 feet straight down to the forest floor. Happily, I only had to lie on the forest floor for about 4 hours before a medevac helicopter came to take me out of that field site and took me from the site to Port Angeles and from Port Angeles to here at Harborview Medical Center. I sustained a lot of injuries. This is just sort of the list of things that the people in the ICU found. Broken ribs, fractured pelvis, burst T3 to T7 vertebrae, a lacerated spleen, which they subsequently took out, a punctured lung, broken fibula, and TBI. So that was the sort of roster of injuries that I sustained. But I have to say that the physical injuries were accompanied by, if not the same amount of problems for me as the emotional difficulties I had, the fear that engulfed me in terms of, would I survive? Could I keep my sanity in the face of ICU psychosis? For 2 or 3 days, I literally saw an African-American soldier dressed in a green uniform with a rifle aimed at me, and all of the convincing that I tried to do of my family and doctors and nurses failed to convince them that he was real. I was convinced that my nurse was bringing me poison pills, and it was really, even after I got out of the ICU, what was most fearsome was the nighttime in the wards. The questions of whether I might grow back into my former identity, my identity as a member of a really wonderful family, my husband and my 2 children. I wanted to reconnect with them. I wanted to make sure that I could connect with my son, for example, August, who's a 3rd-year medical student at the University of Washington here, to see his ceremonies, his short coat ceremony, for example. I desperately wanted to be able to reconnect with the life that I knew before. I wanted to reconnect and make sure that I would be once again assuming the identity, my professional identity as a teacher, as a speaker, as a tree climber, as someone who is trying to convey the importance of environmental stability and environmental importance to people outside of academia. I wanted to make sure that I could reconnect with nature, something that's deeply important to me, not just professionally, but emotionally and also spiritually, that I take an annual pilgrimage to the Olympic Peninsula each year to do a solo hike up and over the Olympic Mountains. It's something that renews me, that refreshes me, that puts me back in contact with nature, with friends, and with myself. What was very important to me were the human connections that I made while I was in the hospital, the human connections that provided humor, my daughter pulling my braids apart, which was really important in the somber atmosphere, my friends visiting me as I started recovering. And I want to say especially that it was not only the doctors' expertise and their conversations and discussions with me about the medical aspects, but it was also the nurses that to me was so incredibly important. They were the ones that would see me day after day, that would give me medications, that would empty the bedpans, that would have conversations about me, about their children, and compare them to my children. And I just want to say that one of my very most important factors in my recovery was my nurse Joel, and I think Joel is here. And I just want to say how much I appreciate Joel. Because he was the one that really knew how much I love trees, and he also is a tree lover. So there was a connection. There was not only a medical connection, a caregiver connection, but there was a very important nature and human connection that went on. And that was one of the things that sustained me and helped me improve, helped me take my pathway to recover, helped me knit back together my injured self with my healthy self. And I can't go on with all of the details that happened in between my time at Harborview and my life now, but I want to say that just 2 weeks ago I was back up in the trees in my field site in Costa Rica, climbing again with these mountain climbing techniques, contributing to the research that I feel is very important in terms of rainforest ecosystems, and connecting to the self that has been so important to me. I want to go to the sort of a second piece of my talk, which is about this idea of systems, of how we might understand, how I might understand my own recovery in the realm by using the technique of looking at other systems. And I have to say, as I was recovering, I had a lot of time to think about this as I was flat on my back. But one of the things that I talked about or thought about as I was recovering harkened back to my own research of these relic trees, thinking myself in some ways as a survivor myself, but also thinking about what are the ways that I could perhaps use my experience in disturbance and recovery to understand these systems that I'm desperately interested that have also experienced disturbance and recovery. And I began thinking about ways I could do this, and I actually put in a proposal to the National Science Foundation, but they said, you know, Dr. Nadkarni, we think it's very important to study these, but there's no theory about relic structures in disturbed systems. There's no ecological theory. And as I was sitting there, you know, surrounded by people who have been in trauma, I began thinking about how a disturbed forest, one that experiences a clear cut, a damage, might be very much like a burn trauma of a hand. That is a disturbed patch of forest or skin. How does it go about getting through recovery? How does it regenerate? How does it become restored? And so I thought that perhaps looking at other systems that are concerned with disturbance and recovery might be a good way to solve my own questions about forest ecology, but also about my own personal journey, threads of disturbance and recovery. So I had convened a number of people to talk about this, and I want to just give you an idea of what came out of discussions of disturbance and recovery in the fields of forest ecology, which I represented. We had another faculty member from refugee studies, another from modern dance, another from traffic engineering, urban planning, and the neurosciences. All of these fields, in one way or another, deal with this concept of disturbance and recovery. We decided to meet together 2 hours a month. First of all, the first semester, we each talked about our own fields and how we deal with disturbance and recovery, how we come to understand it, the tools we use, the models we use, the practices we use in order to discover and understand disturbance and recovery. The second semester, what we tried to do was pull emerging concepts from each of these fields to try to come up with some synthesis and integration, some understanding at a higher level of disturbance and recovery. And I'd like to share 5 emerging concepts that came out of that exercise, that colloquium. The first one involves the consequences of disturbance. And I don't know about you here in the medical field, but certainly in the field of forest ecology, disturbance is generally thought of as being very negative. Forest fires are catastrophes. They end up with these sort of barren deserts of tree skeletons. So they're viewed as something negative. But the faculty member who studies refugee studies said, just a minute, although refugees who are disturbed, populations from their home country of South Sudan, for example, who come to America for a new life, yes, there's disturbance, yes, there are problems that accompany that, but there's also some positive things that come out of that. Young women, for example, who would never get an education in South Sudan, when they come to America, they are exposed to education. Their families allow them to get education. So there is sometimes something positive coming out of disturbance. And in fact, our artist faculty member said, well, in fact, we in the arts welcome disturbance. If there wasn't disturbance, we'd still be stuck doing ballet instead of having modern dance. And so from her standpoint, disturbance is a creative force. It's something to be fostered, something to be sought after, something to be nurtured in terms of the arts. So disturbance then can have a variable outcome, not just negative, but also positive. A second emerging idea that came out was this idea that knowledge enhances recovery. And this idea really came out from our traffic engineer. He understands with his field that in fact, although cars are particulate things, they're individuals, when they start moving together, they actually form a flow. And therefore, he can use the physics, theories of physics, of flow theory, of fluid dynamics, to understand and predict traffic movement. And when there's a traffic jam, by having this knowledge of traffic and how it works, he and his colleagues are able then to mitigate the negative effects of a disturbance in traffic. Now, you may not believe that living here in Seattle, but that is actually true of traffic in general. Well, the same thing actually applied to me as I was recovering, that knowledge enhances recovery. I had a fabulous medical team who transmitted their understanding of the many traumatic injuries that I had. This was not only the doctors themselves, but all of the members of the team, that there were nurses, there were radiologists, and I myself sought data as I could. Every now and then I had access to the internet and I would look up what kind of surgery I had and what my expectations were. I didn't always get accurate information from the internet, but data was very important in my mind as a scientist to try to mitigate the negative effects that I suffered from my disturbance. A third sort of trend or emerging idea that came out of this colloquium is that there can be shifts in functional roles following disturbance. The whole field of neuroscience now, as you know, is rampant with this idea of neuroplasticity. In the past, we thought if a neuron was disturbed through trauma or a stroke, that was it for that neuron. But we now know, people in neuroscience know, and our neuroscience faculty member told us, that in fact there can be shifts in the functions of these neurons, and they can actually speed recovery and allow recovery to happen. Well, again, applying that idea of the shifts in functional roles in my life recovering is I found that there were, in fact, positive functional shifts. Prior to my accident, I was the one who made the beds, who made the lunches, who made the breakfast, but my wonderful husband, Jack, actually moved into that, and he shifted his functional role in many ways, not just in making the beds, but it allowed me then to understand that, in fact, for recovery to happen, we sometimes have to allow these roles to change. Other roles that changed were my own children. August, here he is at 3 years old, and I'm being his mother. I am caring for him. I am looking out for his well-being and his development. But when I was in recovery, it was August who looked out for me, who took me for wheelchair rides, who assured me late at night when he was sleeping next to me in the hospital bed that it was going to be all right. And I believed him partly because he's a medical student, and so I figured he knows everything about that. My daughter Erica as well, whom I cherished and nurtured as a mother, she too stayed by my bedside, and as I was recovering, she contributed to the ways that I could recover physically and emotionally. So both of my children then shifted in their function, and I shifted in their function, not as the mother who always had to care for them, but as a person who needed their care as well. A fourth and more perhaps subtle way of thinking about recovery and some of the emerging properties that came out of this colloquium involved what we started calling the third state. And this involves really something very critical here, I think, which is that we tend to think of being in one or the other state. Either we're in our original state, that is me climbing a tree in Costa Rica 2 years ago, or I'm in a disturbed state, that is me being medevaced into the trauma bay here at Harborview Medical Center. And that we cycle from one to the other, and that this cycle is not complete until after disturbance we get back to that original state. But what kept coming up in our colloquium with all these representatives of these different disciplines is in fact that does not always happen. In fact, it's actually more normal not to make one recovery back to the original state, but rather there might be a third state, or a fourth state, or a fifth state that we might move into after a disturbance. And our professor in urban ecology, who was studying the effects of Hurricane Katrina on New Orleans, made it very clear that in the original state we have a neighborhood, there's a disturbed state when the hurricane actually came through, but there's a second state, but there's a third state, which was the reconstruction of those same neighborhoods after the hurricane. That was neither the disturbed state nor the original state. It wasn't a better neighborhood or a worse neighborhood, it was a different neighborhood. And this to me turned out to be a very important concept that I took to my own recovery. For example, my third state did and is still involved with a broken fibula. My fibula never actually healed. It was a non-union. This happens about 5% of the time. I've had to learn that I can't run half marathons the way I used to run before my accident, but I can run up to 3 miles before my leg starts bugging me. And I've learned that I can go swimming, and I do go swimming now, which is actually sort of better exercise for me at this stage of my life. So I'm in a third state. And I've had to learn to say it's not bad or good, it's not better or worse, it's just a different state of being. And I've seen that this is true not only of my physical state, but sort of my emotional and psychological state about where I am in my life. Now I have to say that all my life I have been what I think of as riding a bright red arrow of purpose, of need, of desire, of passion, to save trees, to help forests. And I've started programs and done projects and gotten my PhD and trained other students to do this very important work. And I've always been sure of it. I haven't always been sure of exactly how to do it, what project to start next, but I know I have to start another project. I know I can't let up on this because of the state of the world's forests. But after my accident, I have found that bright red arrow is kind of fading. I'm not so sure myself that this is the important work that I need to do right now. I'm not sure if I need to do more of it. I'm not sure what I need to do. I mean, life is really short. I've learned that. I've learned that a rope can fail in a single instant. I learned that I can enter a hospital like this in 4 hours and have my entire life changed. Life may not be infinite. I may not get that 30 years that I'm counting on. And so it leaves me feeling like this. Not alone and isolated, but just wondering, what is my next arrow? Is there a next arrow? I've never lived without an arrow. So I'm kind of exploring this new way of being, this new way of thinking, this new way of existing in my post-recovery world. It's not better, it's not worse, it's just a different place. The fifth emerging principle that I have come up with is or that not I, but all of us in this colloquium have come up with, is the importance of the web of relationships in recovery. This is true of these isolated relic trees that I've studied, that that tree needs the relationships of pollinators, of birds that can pollinate that tree, flying from the primary forest adjacent to it across the desert of prairie, of grassland, over to that tree to make pollination happen if that tree is to survive. The role of birds that might disperse the fruits and seeds of that tree has to really reforge, reknit, create a tapestry again of relationships of trees from the primary forest to that isolated tree. And this was true for me as well, that it was the web of relationships of me when I was in that first primary panic time of being in the ICU, that my son and my husband and my daughter and my friends came around and were there to assure me that those threads of connection were not broken. Not everybody has a family that can come there and be there and stay there all the time. And actually my daughter decided that she would make this poster with images of our family. She did this the day she got here, the day after I entered Harborview. In her millennial way, she had her laptop and she just downloaded and printed out photos at your local Kinko's here and made this poster, which moved with me as I transferred from one ward to another, from one bed to another. So even when my family was not there, I had this visual, this wonderful visual of knowing that my family was there. Caring Bridge is another really wonderful way to connect with people who can't possibly be at your bedside. I had over 7,000 messages in 6 months from people whom I've known from elementary school to graduate school to my current professional and personal lives. The web of very, very important connections were my peers. My peers, as I was a patient, happened to be my roommates. I actually loved being in a double rather than a single because I had somebody next to me, somebody who was experiencing not the same injuries, not the same conditions, but someone who has experienced the kinds of fears and reassurances, the threads of recovery that were so tenuous at that point, so important that we knit them together. And so this was a very important part of recovery. There's a wonderful group called Thrive that's just getting off the ground, that's sponsored by the Society for Critical Care Medicine, that it's trying to set up peer groups for people who have experienced traumas outside the hospital. That is, there are peer groups that you can join in a number of cities now, where you can meet your peers, you can again discuss and have those threads of recovery interweave with each other, the way perhaps a family member or a friend or a professional colleague simply can't relate to. The web of relationships for me extended not just to people but to nature, as I said, and as I know many of you are aware of, the presence of nature, the view of nature, even images of nature can speed recovery. Roger Ulrich, a behavioral psychologist, has published a number of papers as far back as 1984 that established experimentally that those patients that see nature, even outside a window, require fewer narcotics, experience fewer complications, spend fewer days in the hospital, and have fewer nurse complaints. So that all speeds recovery simply by viewing some images of nature outside of a window. Obviously not all hospitals and not all wards on hospitals have the value of seeing nature, and so now there are actually companies, as you probably know, like Skyview, for example, that produce these panels that can be put on walls and in ceilings that produce the sense that nature is nearby, providing that comfort. Well, my family and friends were really ingenious about this. One of my friends created what they called a recover tree. He sent out a note to friends and said, send Nalini a tree with a message on it. And he put those together, and that tree hung above me, again, as I moved from ward to ward. So I had a sense of nature. My graduate students made these wonderful tissue flowers, which again traveled around with me. So I had a sense that I was still connected to nature. I was part of that web of relationships, that tapestry between humans and nature that was so important in my recovery. I wanted to just share with you an idea that might induce or produce more nature in the hospital environment. And this is involved with linking and weaving together the values of fashion with recovery and health, not only of people, but also of nature. Ecologists are not known for their sense of fashion. I don't know about doctors. But what I decided to do was to create fashion that had images of nature. And what I did was take an image of a plant that grows in the forest canopy, Piper aridum, that's related to the black pepper that you put on your scrambled eggs this morning, printed on fabric, made a little jacket out of it. You can see I'm actually wearing the same jacket today. And I have a little hang tag that goes along with it that talks about, and you can read about the biology and the conservation of that species. So, for example, if Heather saw me in a Starbucks wearing this jacket and said, Nalini, I like your jacket, I could say, well, let me tell you about Piper aridum. It's actually related to black pepper, what you put on your scrambled eggs, and let me tell you how to conserve it. So why not apply this to the hospitals? Gowns and scrubs are about the dullest kinds of fashion I have ever seen in my life. So my idea is to bring nature to the scrubs of people who need to use scrubs and gowns. I actually started a project with this, my Bright Red Arrow days, where I went to there's a Shriners Children's Hospital in my neighborhood in Salt Lake City. I asked if I could sort of do a pilot study. We created these gowns with a tree, with a solar system. We also created some nurses' scrubs with images of birds and so forth. And the idea was really that this would not only bring nature into the environment, the walking environment, but that this could be sort of a vector not only of comfort, but also education. And so we did a survey in the hospital where we were working. We found that over 80% wanted, the patients and the parents of these children patients wanted nature images on their own gowns. They were excited about having nurses having these images. The nursing staff were very positive about it, and they actually said that they would wear these nurses' scrubs. This also goes to a question that Dr. Goss asked in a conference we had just earlier this morning about how can people learn to identify their doctors and understand that this is their doctor. So it might be that, you know, if Dr. Goss, for example, wanted to wear a lion image, that he would be the lion doctor. And so they may not know his name, but they would know him as the man who has the soul of a lion, which I think is really wonderful. So all of those ideas, I think, I'd like to just sort of summarize here in terms of the insights that we got from this interdisciplinary colloquium, that there is a range of consequences of disturbance from negative to positive. The fact that knowledge enhances recovery, that if we know what's going on, we have a better chance, a better route, a better set of threads to interweave with our own recovery. There can be shifts in functional roles that might be beneficial. There might be a third state that we come to rather than our original state. And I would advise those who are communicating with patients not to exert a set of expectations on your patients. And I know that I got this all the time. Not just nurses and medical staff, but people I would see on the street or people who were my friends would say, well, Nalini, are you back to yourself? And they desperately wanted to hear me say, yes, I am back to myself. I am tree climbing. I am being a great mom. I'm making the beds. My husband especially wanted to hear that. But actually, the question is, who are you now? How well do you feel? Are you doing the kinds of things you love to do and that are important to you, rather than setting up some false or previous assumed sense of who you must be. And finally, the most important one to me, was this web of relationships. This idea of needing to weave nature and nature imagery into the threads of recovery that I experienced. The third thing that I'd like to talk to you about involves sort of enlarging this tapestry to go beyond the medical world. That is, to take what we have learned about treating patients and helping them into recovery to other realms. And I'll just give you one example of how this medical world might stretch its threads into other looms to help create other useful tapestries. So we know that hospital rooms and waiting rooms can be bereft of nature, that people are anxious, and the lack of nature tends to make us more anxious, and the presence of nature tends to calm us, to soothe us. Well, I began thinking about what other realms have places that are nature deprived and have people in them who are stressed out. Well, prisons are certainly a place where that occurs. This is a room of a solitary confinement exercise room in a prison in Washington State. And actually one of the things that I do in addition to climbing trees is to work with incarcerated populations, to bring ideas of nature and to bring nature itself, conservation projects, science lectures to the world of the incarcerated. I've been doing this for about 13 years. It's something I feel is very important in addition to the scientific work that I do. We started about 13 years ago here in Washington State, just starting with a simple science lecture series. That sort of turned into a sustainability, what we call the Sustainability in Prisons project, where we bring sustainability projects, organic gardens, beekeeping and recycling to prisoners. That then expanded into bringing conservation projects into groups so that inmates can actually participate very actively in trying to help the earth. So we've trained the men to raise endangered species like the Oregon spotted frog, endangered species, prairie plants, and the tailored checker spot butterfly, which are then reintroduced into areas and projects of ecological restoration. Well, I've been very happy with this set of projects, part of the bright red arrow, but I soon realized after I started this project that in fact there are parts of prisons where we simply could not bring sustainability and conservation projects, and of course that's in secluded housing, in solitary confinement, where we just, for security reasons, we can't bring those, bring materials and information into those cells and to those inmates. So thinking about what I knew about the importance of nature and nature imagery for calming me down, for enhancing recovery in another nature-deprived environment like hospital rooms, I proposed to a maximum security prison in Oregon that we bring nature videos to men and women in solitary confinement. I proposed to them that this seemed to work in terms of enhancing recovery in hospitals, and that was a sort of ammunition and evidence that I needed to convince the prison administrators that this might be a good idea to make the men more calm, to soothe them, and to bring down aggression and violence, and thereby make the prison environment a safer environment, not just for the inmates, but also for the corrections office. Well, we instituted this. We had a cell block that was split in half. We showed half of the cell block men in their exercise room nature videos. The other half did not see videos. After a year, we came back. We did surveys. We did interviews of the staff and of the men. And what was the most exciting and important result was that, in fact, the men who had watched the nature videos for a year committed 26% fewer violent infractions. They also self-reported that they felt calmer, they felt less violent, they felt less aggressive, and after they saw that film, when they went back to those horrible cells, they were able to hold on to that. They were able to retain that sense of calm. And so although this is not solving all the problems of mass incarceration, just like healing a single patient is not solving all the problems of the medical world, it is certainly something that is in the direction of trying to ameliorate a really difficult situation. So, So I feel that my fall has really resulted in an understanding not only of my beloved rainforests and my beloved trees, not only of the connections about recovery and interactions of nature and humans and so forth of my own body, but also about how we might treat intricate systems as tapestries, and showed me the need for interweaving different disciplines and understandings and ways of approaching and ways of knowing our systems. What I'd like to do is to sort of to pull this together, is to show you a very short part of a brief video that was made about my recovery. I think images and music can be very powerful in terms of communicating and weaving together the complex messages that are involved with the processes of disturbance and recovery. So what I'd like to do is show you a little bit of this video, because I believe that it pulls together some of the ideas that I've been thinking about, that I've been sharing with my colleagues and they have shared with me, and also what I've been hearing here at Harborview Medical Center about the desire to understand and mitigate the problems of disturbance and to move forward with the tapestry of recovery. But I think what I've learned from this experience is something actually that was articulated by a friend of mine in Olympia, Washington, a woman named Jean Cavendish. And I told her about my worries, like, am I going to be able to be the old Nalini? And she said, well, Nalini, you've been stopped. You've been stopped. So, what are you going to do about that? And she also told me that, she said, when you get to this place of patience and boredom, where you're going to be for a while, that is going to open up the realm of creativity and spirituality. The realm of creativity and spirituality. Well, there's a wonderful promise, isn't it? Was not that this trauma was a terrible thing, but rather that it was something that allowed me to be stopped, and with that stopping, allowed for patience and boredom in order to enter this realm of creativity and spirituality. Love is incredibly important in recovery. And it's such a trite statement, but at the same time, because I learned it these last 2 months, I'm really such a firm believer in the idea that this web of social relationships is essential for our health, in all meanings of the word health. So this idea that our lives and the lives of the planet are dynamic is essential, it's basic, and yet it's something I think we push away because we don't want to be reminded of our own mortality. And yet it's all around us. I mean, so here's the dynamic of Nalini climbing a tree and flunking to the forest floor. Well, if you put that in the context of the forest is subject to amazing forces of dynamicism, of forest fire, of windstorms, of hurricanes, of insect attacks. And at the level of a single tree or the level of the forest as a whole, that forest is the trees in the forest is gonna fall down at some point, and what's gonna happen next? Again, at the level of a single tree or the forest as a whole, it's going to resprout and grow again. This sense of the universality of the dynamics of systems of whatever kind, I think, is something that we can look at with at least acceptance and possibly with joy, because I think there's some really joyful things that can come out of it. I feel joyful on certain days in certain ways that this happened to me because of what I've learned from the process, what I've learned from the people around me, what I've learned about the medical profession, what I've learned about life, I think, and about myself most of all, is who am I? Is it what I do, or is it who I am? And who is that person going to be? Not sure yet, but I'll find out. So it is, it's not just disturbance and recovery, it's an ongoing process, and it will continue to be ongoing. I don't know how it will end or where it will move towards, but one thing I do know is that the foundation for the tapestry of my own recovery started here at the Harborview Medical Center. And for that I am grateful. I'm grateful to all the people here who made that possible so that I could continue to do the work that I still think is important. And so I wanted to close with just a kind of a little bit about a message about health and hope and how that happens, especially for people who are constantly exposed, as you are, to disturbance, and sometimes recovery, and sometimes not recovery. I want to tell you about how one thing that I have worked on, which is to see hope in what seems to be a static situation. And I use, again, trees as my metaphor, that when I look at a trunk of a tree, a giant long life tree like this, it certainly seems that it's not moving anywhere. It's not moving anywhere. But if I turn my eyes upward to the twigs of the trees, to somewhere other than that static rooted thing that won't move, I know, I sit in the canopy and I watch these leaves move. I do know that this tree is moving. And I decided to harness that to try to better understand it. And so I tied paintbrushes on the tips of these twigs, and I held up a piece of art paper, and I allowed that tree to move in time, in the wind. And after 2 minutes, that tree made a wonderful painting. I think it looks sort of Chinesey. I think it's actually very beautiful. And being a scientist, I had to know, like, how far did that tree move? And so I measured all the segments of it. I added them up, and then I multiplied the number of twigs per branch, the number of branches per tree, the number of minutes. I timed it for 2 minutes per hour, minutes per hour, hours per day, days per year. And so I learned that, in fact, that organism that has lived for 200 years and not moved an inch, if you look at the trunk, actually moves quite far. And I'm wondering if any of you might guess how far a single Douglas fir tree moves in a year if you look at the twigs.
14 miles.
14 miles.
20,000 miles.
Well, the answer is 186,000 miles, 540 miles, which is 7 times around the circumference of the Earth. And the message here, I think, is really that there is movement. That the small things we do, the movement of a little leaf on a big tree, the recovery of a single patient, although she may be still wearing a Miami J collar and walking with a walker, that is movement, that is progress that you have helped make. And so I want to thank you again for the care and the knowledge and the collaboration that you provided. I'm grateful for this experience, the experiences that you have given me here at Harborview. I'm grateful for what you have created, something that is complex, that is connected, that is strong but fragile, that is useful, and especially that is beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Heather.
Well, I'm totally at a loss for words, and I just want to invite you to ask any questions of Nalini, because she's just such a wonderful teacher, as you can see. There's so much to learn from her.
When do you first have memories of, do you remember coming to Harborview? Do you remember waking up in the ICU?
That's a great question. Many people have asked me, and I've asked myself, what do I remember? I've struggled to remember the fall. I cannot remember anything of the fall itself, nor the 5 minutes before I fell. I knew I was in the tree, and then the next thing I knew, I was lying on my back. I was conked out for about 10 minutes, according to my graduate. I had 3 graduate students with me. I was awake at that time. I was conscious after I'd been sort of knocked out. I waited that 4 hours, and it felt like 40 hours. And I talked to them. I was conscious and aware. I heard the helicopter coming. I remember the helicopter EMT people, and then after that, I really don't remember anything until I woke up in the ICU. And I have to say that although, I so appreciate the trauma team that was so fabulous, I really don't remember much of anything except that soldier with the green uniform pointing a rifle at me because of that psychosis. When I look at the pictures of my families and friends in the ICU, I don't even remember that they were there. But of course, after that sort of ICU psychosis and confusion left, I remember almost everything of what I experienced during the following 4 or 5 weeks that I was in the hospital. Like Joel, for example, and many of the other nurses and therapists. I had conversations with the chaplain when I was sort of struggling to find my way in spiritual wise. So the rest of that stay is very much in my mind, but that chunk between the fall and the arrival of the helicopter and being in the ICU, I'm afraid, is just gone. Well, maybe it's not a bad thing that it's all gone, but it's gone. Yes, in the back?
Was there a time when you thought the door was closed and it wasn't going to open again? And did you open it or someone help open it?
The door of life?
Yes.
Interestingly, no. I had a sense that I was going to live. The more sort of difficult thing was I was so filled with fear because of the uncertainty of how I would be living. I didn't know if I would walk. I didn't know if I would always be dependent on my family and friends. I didn't know if I would be able to walk out myself in nature. I didn't know if I'd be wheelchair bound. I didn't know whether the fuzz in my head of TBI was going to ever clear and I could write another paper or engage in a solid intellectual conversation. But the fear of death was not, it wasn't like the breath of death on me. What did happen though, and I still have now, is a sense of the fragility of life as I have never had it before. That I am aware of dangers, that I am afraid for, my daughter when she takes off in a car and I think, oh my gosh, she might be in a crash and I might never see her again. So I have a much more heightened sensitivity of the presence of death in my life that this fall and this recovery has presented me with. So I no longer take things for granted. I don't, every goodbye I say, I find is this could be a goodbye. Every time I cross the street, I actually look, back and forth 3 times. So it's almost like PTSD perhaps, but it isn't really that. It's more an awareness of how in fact short life is. And because I've always been a healthy person and always been an adventurous person, it's a different way of living than it was before. Even though I did not fear exactly specifically for my death at the time when I was close to it.
So what do you most want to do with whatever life you have left?
Let me tell you about what I want to do and how I plan to do it, and we'll just go back here through. If I want to answer your question, then I have to go back to, sorry about making you dizzy here, but I can't answer it because I'm here. Is that I don't really know. I mean, most people when you always read like Morgan Freeman's movie, The Bucket List or whatever that was, he had a list of stuff he wanted to do. I've tried to write that list now, especially because I'm more aware of death, and I can't think of another thing to put on it except to live. And I think now be present with the small and big things that are offered to me every day. When I walk down the street and see a person asking for money, I think of him as a person now who is in his present. And I think of every flower that's now blooming in Utah that I encounter when I go for my 3-mile run and think, I'm glad to see that lavender blooming now. I mean, it sounds sappy, but actually it's actually true. And so that does not trouble me as I would have been bothered by not having a bright red arrow before my fall. That is okay with me right now. I have confidence that even if I don't find or make or create another red arrow, I'm still okay because I'm alive and I'm still connected to nature and my family and my friends, and I'm grateful for that. And it's not, I mean, if you saw my life right now, I'm still a biology professor. I just got 2 new NSF grants. I'm traveling around the world giving conferences and talks and so forth. So on the outside, I look pretty much like the old Nalini. But if you look at me inside, I'm really different. And at first it was really very difficult for me to reconcile that. The words of Jean Cavendish encouraged me that this is the time, this is the opportunity for living a more creative and spiritual life. I can't say that I feel I'm doing that necessarily, and I've been troubled by it. I actually made an appointment with my Unitarian minister to ask him, Tom, how do I live a more spiritual life? Are there some books I could read? And he said, Nalini, if you're asking me that question, there is no way you're going to. So he said, it's not a thing you check off. Being spiritual is a way you are. And he said, you're already connected. You already think about these things. And so part of it has been the realization that these things I dream of being, of creativity, that I'm a creative person, I'm a connecting person, I'm a hardworking person, I'm a passionate person, or I'm a quiet person. It turns out I'm kind of already there in a way. But it took this fall, this stopping, as Jean Cavendish said, to make me understand that. And so I'm in no hurry to find the next red arrow, because I think that that is an okay place to be.
Yeah, you obviously have had a lot of experience looking at complex systems. Harborview is a very complex system.
Yes.
Do you have any observations that you think could help us improve our system?
We actually had some breakout groups. Dr. Goss invited some patients to come and talk earlier this morning, and we got into these little breakout groups. And one of the things that came up in my group was about systems, that healthcare systems are systems. And I talked about this traffic system that I had been exposed to with R.J. Porter, the traffic engineer. And one of the things he said was, well, we know how to mitigate traffic. Again, in Seattle, we may not really believe this, but the way they know about traffic is because they have tons and tons of data that there are, every road, every major artery has traffic monitors, and those go into giant databases, so that even though traffic seems chaotic, when you have a large enough data set and people who can analyze it, cars behave in sort of certain categorical ways in terms of flow. And so by having a large data set of the participants, you can actually come to some knowledge of how to best manage it. And then other people in the group said, well, we talk about patient flows at the hospital, patients coming in and coming out and how they work and what goes on. So I think that because what I have come to understand is that healthcare systems are so complex, you have such a big volume. It's not predictable, it's sporadic, and it's highly variable. I think that makes it a very complex system. But perhaps systems thinking, and I'm sure this has been, and people have tried to apply it to health systems, I think that is one way to go. Another thing that came out of that breakout session was that, in fact, it's not just a system. It's not just one size fits all. And maybe what we need is to not think of it as a system of uniform cars driving down I-5, but think about care. Think about the comfort of a single patient. Think about, how can I listen to this patient? How can I make this patient's recovery better? And maybe that's the answer to it. Obviously, I don't know what the answer is to that, but I'm really thinking about it as I come to understand more and more through my own personal experiences, and now that I'm beginning to talk about and share these experiences with different medical groups, I'm thinking that maybe ecology and ecological systems and all these other systems I talk about might have something not only to offer the medical system, but that the medical system might offer to other systems as well.
It sounds like support was very important to you,
yes,
with your family and your friends, and then after you left, you had a lot of professional support, intellectual support. And I'm wondering, you showed Thrive up there. I wonder if you reached out to any patient support groups during your stay.
I did not. I did not reach out to Thrive or to, there wasn't one in Salt Lake, there's no chapter in Salt Lake City. And I didn't even know it existed, except my brother, who's also a physician, let me know about this. And that was one of the problems, is that I didn't see support systems. I mean, I know there's support systems for alcoholics and depression groups and so forth, but I didn't see any for, post-traumatic care. And I'm probably someone who didn't need it as much as many people who don't have the support systems that I was fortunate to have. But I was mentioning earlier this morning that every time I was, especially when I was a parent, it was apparent to me that I was, and others, that I was in recovery. I was wearing this Miami J collar, I was working with a walker, I had a boot on my foot, that if I saw someone, like I remember crossing the street and seeing a guy with an amputated arm, we sort of exchanged this look as we crossed the street, like, I understand it, I get it. And people would come up to me in grocery stores and look at me and say, oh my gosh, Nalini, it looks like you've had a terrible accident. Let me tell you about my terrible accident. I felt like, oh my God, I don't need this. But then you know what I realized? I did need that. That is exactly what I needed. Because I would say, well, tell me your story. When were you wearing a Miami J collar? And suddenly we'd have this conversation, and their experience was not mine nor mine theirs, but what happened was there was like this mini little peer support group where we could pour out our hearts in ways that I actually couldn't with my husband, because I'd say, oh, he doesn't want to hear about this fear again, or he doesn't want to hear about that again, because he wasn't a peer, he was a supporter. So I believe very strongly that building up and enhancing the peer support groups or mechanisms, whether it's a group or an individual, is very important. That's why my roommates were so important. That's why that man with the amputated arm was so important. And we were just talking at lunch about families having support with other families. In waiting rooms, families tend to talk to each other. Well, maybe there could be a family support group here at Harborview where people could exchange experiences and hopeful messages, or asking for help, or could there be a bulletin board where people could put messages? So I think there are different ways of getting that peer support, but I think that is really one piece of this, one thread of this tapestry of recovery that has been underexploited in terms of the positive effects that it could have. Yes, in the back?
Was your patient and family experience impacted by the fact that we're a teaching hospital?
That you're a teaching hospital? You know, at the time I really wasn't aware that it was a teaching hospital. These doctors and their entourages would be like a flock of birds flying in, alighting for a short time, giving me information, asking me, do you have any questions, and then sort of flying away. And I really couldn't even tell who were the who was the intern, who was the resident, and it wasn't that it was confusing, it just sort of actually didn't really matter. At least when I was, especially in the early stages. I could distinguish nurses and therapists, but whether it was a teaching hospital or not was quite opaque to me.
I just wanted to give a comment, just my overall sensation of this, 3 words and then 6 words. So, science is art, art is science. So.
Nice. That's right, I believe that too.
Well, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to Dr. Goss for making it possible. Really appreciate you taking an hour out of your day to think about this, and I hope that you'll be able to take this with you like I know I will.